Welcome to Afternoon Briefing this Friday. Greg Jennett with you from Parliament House in Canberra here on Ngunnawal Country.
And I'm Fran Kelly on Gadigal land in Sydney.
Yes, Fran, not that we're counting or anything, but 4 weeks we made it. We're 2/3 of the way through this campaign, believe it or not. This feels like it at times.
That's it. I know, exactly. We've reached day 26 of this campaign. It seems to have jumped a week without me noticing, which is great. Maybe a point of some exhaustion too, though, I think. Certainly the contest of policy ideas has slowed right down this week, I think, leaving Scott Morrison to allocate most of his energies towards warning of the dangers of the chaos of a hung parliament.
Yes, he did that, Fran, on a dash to Western Australia today, seeking to protect their 3, if not even more, seats around the city of Perth, while Anthony Albanese kept it close to home in his own electorate of Grayndler, trying to assure everyone that he's across all of his policy details and that everything's running well for him a week on from his release from COVID isolation.
How you going? Good
How are you?
How's it going?
Oh, we need an extra pair of hands.
This is the Addy Road dog.
Well, last time you did a good job. You did a better job than me, so...
What we actually need is strategies and plans to make sure that no one is left behind.
You're doing a great job and we want you in.
Thank you.
Have your own colleagues told you to be more across the details?
My own colleagues are part of a cohesive, strong, united, experienced team.
Mr Turnbull, who are you voting for?
It's a secret ballot and I'll keep that to myself. And what we have to do is support democracy. I'm not telling anybody who to vote for.
If they won't tell you how they would vote, how could you vote for them? The choice you make at this election will have a very significant impact for you and your family.
Yes.
Could you imagine each and every day having to go to that chorus of independents, the Greens and everyone else? I mean, they're weak enough as it is. Could you imagine the chaos of that type of a parliament?
Hey, it's the big. Hey, good morning. Great to see you.
As this campaign has gone on, we've seen just how much we don't know about the Labor Party.
How are you going to stand up to Xi Jinping if you can't stand up to us?
People are entitled to ask questions. Where's your mum or dad? That's your mummy. Hi, mummy. Thanks very much for that contribution.
Goodness me.
This is a fully integrated plug-and-play system.
Have an economic plan for the future, one that has taken us through these very difficult times.
One more?
I tell you what it is about. It is about serious plans on serious issues.
Pretty tough here again.
This is an example of what puts people off politics. You cannot have a clearer answer than that Labor is putting additional funding into health, education and the NDIS, and we stand by it. And you know what puts people off politics? That sort of word game. That is very clear. It can't be clearer. We stand by our additional funding. That's not a cut, that's more funding.
Every single day is hard. You've got to make tough decisions every day. If Anthony Albanese thinks the campaign is hard, I've got news for him. Government's a lot harder.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your work.
Anthony Albanese thanking people at the Addison Road Community Centre in his electorate of Grayndler in Marrickville in Sydney. That centre does a fantastic job, did a great job, particularly for those who are having a hard time during the pandemic in some of those southwestern suburbs of Sydney. Sure. They really do put in. But as you saw there, Greg, Anthony Albanese came under a fair hammering from the travelling press pack today after he came up short yesterday on the finer points of Labor's NDIS 6-point plan. So today, his mission was to instill confidence that he's across the details and to push back against some pretty raucous questioning sometimes. The Labor leader, by and large, accomplished that. But at times, I think it's fair to say his exasperation morphed into anger. He declared at one point, "I'm in charge here." We'll be hearing more about Labor's NDIS drama a little later in the show. We'll be speaking with Shadow Minister Bill Shorten. But generally, a better performance from the opposition leader today, even though he's under pressure from the press about his work rate in this campaign so far.
Yeah, fairly or unfairly, Fran, we're not sure what we're to read into this, but as far as public visibility goes today, Anthony Albanese was almost almost done, really, by mid-morning in Sydney. That's ahead of a community function in Parramatta tonight. There wasn't much in the way of new policy announcements on offer from Labor today, so inevitably that's led to more questions about how he's coping after his COVID isolation and whether he's slowing down his campaign in order to, quote, take a rest in the afternoon. Well, emphatically, Anthony Albanese's having none of this, Fran. He insists he's firing on all cylinders, and to prove it, he ran through his program from yesterday.
In terms of my health, look, it's still. I think you've had COVID. It has an impact, doesn't it?
I haven't needed to have a nap in the afternoon. You're running to be Prime Minister. The question is whether are you match fit heading into polling day? It has an impact.
Well, I'll tell you what I did yesterday. I got up in the morning, I did breakfast TV. I did radio into Victoria. I went into a smart energy expo in at the convention centre. I talked to providers there. I then did a press conference. I then went down and had a meeting with the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I then went up to the CPO, Commonwealth Parliamentary Officers, and had more meetings. I then went and spoke at a lunch at the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and gave a considered, extensive economic speech about a better future and about productivity. I then went into my electorate office in Marrickville, and then I did Q&A last night.
And then, take that, other words, is what he's saying. Look, he is under a bit of pressure. He let it be known, obviously he had COVID. He let it be known early on in his return from ISO that, you know, he was still feeling pretty knocked around by that. And everyone knew he was going to take it easy for a little while in the afternoons. And now that was turned back on him today, which, you know, I thought was pretty rough treatment, to be honest. Right. But in contrast, Scott Morrison has been in and around Perth suburbs where the government is fighting to hold on to a few seats, as you mentioned, Greg. He was also out in the electorate of Cowan with a posse of West Australian Liberals. And like Anthony Albanese, just a small, pretty localised announcement made today, which left the Prime Minister talking at great length about the dangers, as he sees them, of a hung parliament, perhaps prompted by his predecessor, Malcolm Turnbull, in Washington, who really made a major speech to Harvard today in which he, came pretty close to urging people, well, it sounded like it. He declares he wasn't urging people to do anything other than to vote, but it sounded like he was certainly giving Liberals permission to vote for the so-called teal independents if they wanted to put the small L Liberal moderate values back into the parliament. Yes,
there was certainly that embedded suggestion, wasn't there, Fran? So whether it was Malcolm Turnbull or perhaps even tracking polls that the Liberal team are conducting, something made Scott Morrison dwell, as you say, for ages on this possibility that there may not be a clear majority after the 21st of May. It's almost as if balance of power these days means barrel of powder to this Prime Minister, fearful, I suppose, that the whole show could explode if a hung parliament were to be returned. With so much talk about it, it prompted a question about, well, would Scott Morrison himself be up for leading a party of government under such chaotic circumstances?
I think all of Australia really deserves to know, will you resign as leader in the case of a hung parliament? You say it's a cavalcade of chaos, so will you resign?
This is a choice for the Australian people.
That's not a yes or no answer, Prime Minister.
Well, you get to ask the questions. You don't get to say what the answer is. My answer to that is that answer lies in the lap of the Australian people. See, I'm the first Prime Minister.
That sounds like you would resign.
Well, again, I'll answer the question. I'm very happy to answer the question, and I'll take you through what it is. I'm the first Prime Minister that has been able to stand for election at the last election and then stand for election again. So I'm going to the Australian people at this election, and that's the first time that has happened in about 15 years. And that has provided great stability and certainty, I believe, and that was one of the things I said I would bring back to politics when I became Prime Minister, that I would provide that certainty and stability of leadership, which I have delivered from last election through to this election, and I'm putting myself forward for being able to continue to provide that strong leadership. So the decision for the Australian people is up to them.
All right, well, with little fanfare yesterday, the Labor Party confirmed to ABC News its intention to end Australia's live sheep export trade. It's worth around $100 million a year, and since some very well-reported mass deaths on overheated ships, the trade really has been very heavily regulated. In fact, in the hot summer months, ships don't sail at all these days across the Indian Ocean. Anthony Albanese's today confirmed the ban is going ahead, but no deadline has yet been set for winding up that trade.
Has Labor committed to ending live sheep exports, and will you put a timeline as to when that end will take place?
No, we won't, and we haven't in our policy. Our policy has changed. The amount of live exports has halved in recent times, and will continue the summer ban, but we'll consult with state governments, in particular the Western Australian state government, but we'll also consult with the agricultural sector about the issues around live sheep export.
All right, well, Agriculture Minister David Littleproud's been involved in the regulations of what's left of the mostly West Coast-based live sheep trade these days, and he joins us today from Port Macquarie. Welcome back to Afternoon Briefing, David Littleproud. Look, this live sheep trade has shrunk substantially. I don't know if you dispute the figure, but the numbers we see are about $100 million in value per year. With that in mind and the animal welfare and regulatory issues, why would it be a terrible loss to Australia to see it wound up for good?
Well, the human toll of over 3,000 men and women who are involved in this industry, their jobs just are being thrown on the scrap heap when we've proven to the world that while there was a failure in protocols in 2017, I've reformed the industry. I can give certainty to the community. I can give certainty to the world that we do it better than anyone else, and I'm prepared to back Western Australians based on practical experience rather than ideology. And it's sad to see that the Labor Party would in fact say that they're going to consult with industry. In fact, the only people they've consulted with in creating this policy were animal activists. Farmers found out about this in the media. This is deplorable to think that the Australian Labor Party, this is a window into how they're going to treat Australian farmers, is that they're not going to be consulted, they're going to have their livelihoods taken away without any consultation, about any input, and they're expected to just to suck it up. I mean, that's not the Australian way, and I think Anthony Albanese also added some confusion and chaos today when there was at some point, he didn't really get in behind this when his own Western Australian Premier was saying that the reforms that I put in place have worked, give comfort and give certainty, and we're not trying to export our animal welfare status away to other countries in the world that don't do it the way we do. And we should be proud of what we've achieved, and we should continue on with it, knowing that we can do it better than anyone else.
Yeah, I think there might be a bit of a dispute over what or ambiguity at least, over what Anthony Albanese was trying to say. But just on Western Australia, have you spoken to Mark McGowan? What is it that you're seeking to do? What are your aspirations for this industry? I take it from your comments, it's obviously to keep it, but is it to expand it?
Well, we'll use science as that's what predicated my decisions in reforming. I didn't take a knee-jerk reaction when we had an incident. I actually worked with industry to reform it. Some of those reforms they didn't like, but this was about giving truth and proof to the community and to the world that we did it better than anyone else. I didn't just shut it down overnight like the Labor Party did with the live export of cattle with Indonesia, that not just trashed our relationship with Indonesia, but it's actually cost you, the Australian taxpayer, over $900 million in compensation because of their actions.
Yeah, but can it be grown? Do you want it to grow?
Of course we can, and you've got to understand these markets will continue. They're not in decline. In fact, they were $96 million last year, and in fact next year they're predicted to go to $119 million. And some of the decline has been because of the regulations. We haven't allowed boats to sail in the northern summer for safety reasons, for animal welfare safety reasons. But we've also had this thing called a drought, where some of those Western Australian sheep have found themselves over on the east coast. But these markets will continue because there are cultural reasons, and there's also cold storage supply chain humanitarian reasons why live export of animals will continue. And I just say what the Labor Party's saying here is very important. Is they're putting they're valuing the welfare of an animal from Australia above that from another country. And I can tell you our animal welfare standards are higher in Australia than in other countries like Sudan and Ethiopia, where these countries will then fill the void if Australians aren't there. We do it much better than them. We're happy to work with them to help them get to our standard. But this is about us having a judicial responsibility globally in making sure we meet these markets and we uptake an animal welfare standard that the world can look to and follow. And this is why we will continue to support this market and give farmers certainty.
All right. Look, I want to move you on because time is tight today, David Littleproud, to the general dynamics of the campaign. We have heard the Prime Minister speaking of fire and brimstone in the event of a hung parliament. There is potential, I suppose, for independents in Kennedy and Indi to be added to, perhaps the seat of Nichols arguably in play. Isn't the proof of the pudding here that regional independents are less likely to bring instability to any parliament, certainly less likely to be threatening to a coalition government?
Oh, you take nothing for granted, and they're all independents for a reason. But what we're saying is that if you want to go through the next phase of what will be a very trying time in our nation's history, you've got to reflect the last 3 years. There's been no government that's faced up to the variety or scale of challenges that this one has. But we're now about to face up to the next phase of that. And you need stability, and you have to have the values and principles to get you through that. And if you have to compromise on those values and principles, whether that be national security or the economy, then this will add to the confusion when in times you need certainty.
But you could work with some of these guys. You could work with some of these independents, couldn't you? I mentioned some examples.
Well, you try to work with them, but what do you have to compromise in your values and principles to keep this country safe?
Maybe not
when
much.
There are tough decisions to be made. Well, when there's tough decisions to be made, you just can't think of your own electorate. You have to think nationally about what's in our national interests, and that's the tough decision of being in government. And while Australians at times don't always like what we've done it with the values or principles of keeping you safe and keeping the economy safe. And,
you wouldn't rule it out, though. Just quickly and finally, David Littleproud, you wouldn't rule out if it was a necessity to enter into a compromise and discussion, you'd be prepared to do that with some of those regional independents at least.
Well, that's not my decision to make. That'll be a decision that we'll make after the election as a national party and obviously have that discussion with the Liberal Party as our coalition partner.
Yep, fair enough. I guess we'll be maintaining those conversations over at least the next 2 weeks, perhaps longer, depending what happens on the 21st of May. David Littleproud, thanks for joining us once again on Afternoon Briefing.
Thanks, mate.
All right, why don't we take it back to you, Fran? And, moving on from the matter of live sheep trade, National Disability Insurance Scheme are back in the spotlight again today, at least for Labor.
Yeah. That's right. As we mentioned earlier, for the second day in a row, the opposition leader Anthony Albanese was peppered with questions about Labor's NDIS policy and his inability yesterday to step through the six-point plan. The architect of that policy is the Shadow Minister, Bill Shorten. He's been conducting NDIS forums around the country. I spoke with him earlier from Maroochydore. Bill Shorten, thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Bill Shorten, did you cringe when Anthony Albanese was unable to name the 6 points of your NDIS plan?
Oh, no, not at all. Anthony's doing a great job, and he's been a giant supporter of mine to have a really strong and solid NDIS policy. A policy, by the way, which hasn't been matched by the Liberals in this election.
But you've been a leader on a campaign trail. I'm wondering, after that hiccup yesterday for Anthony Albanese, if you rang him up to give him the benefit of your experience and say, hey, mate, you've got to get across your brief?
No, I wouldn't have said that at all. In fact, I have spoken to him. We spoke about a range of issues, but not that. Listen, the last person who never made a mistake was up on a cross 2,000 years ago. Anthony's done a great job getting us to a competitive position. And I know that when it comes to NDIS, Mr Morris can make all the cheap shots he likes. The reality is there's only one major party with any policies on the NDIS, and that's Labor. The Liberals or the LNP in Queensland are missing in action.
Sure, but are you worried that this, if you can call it a mistake by Anthony Albanese, fits into the Scott Morrison narrative that, you know, he's not up to running the country? Are you worried about ceding that?
Oh. No, I'm not. Mr Morrison's had 3 years since the last election and he's proven to be a complete failure in my opinion. So therefore, no, I'm not worried about the campaign. I'm worried about what will happen to people with disabilities if Mr Morrison gets re-elected. I have to say, Fran, I am dreadfully worried about what will happen to the NDIS if this current crowd get back into power. It'll be a disaster.
OK, well, let's talk about that, because the answer Anthony Albanese did give on a number of occasions was that Labor's plan would put people back at the centre of the NDIS. What does that mean? What does that look like?
What's happened in disability is that the government's been engaging in a program of stealthy cuts. People with disability have been locked out of all decisions with the NDIS. We want to make sure that if you're running a scheme for 500,000 profoundly and severely impaired Australians, that we consult them and that we make sure that the decisions that they're receiving are ones which they're party to. At the moment, the NDIS is top-down, it's out of control, it's run by the lawyers, and it's not run in the best interest of people with disability.
But if you're accusing the government and the NDIA of making stealthy cuts, then we've got a real problem, haven't we, beyond the one we know we have, which is the affordability of the scheme. Already, the NDIS is budgeted to be at $40 billion by 24-25, and that's $8 billion above original estimates. So the costs are blowing out because more people than originally thought have signed up to the scheme and they're staying on it longer. Does Labor have a plan to rein in that spending without cutting services?
Absolutely. First of all, there's a competency problem with the NDIS. There's not a sustainability problem. This government's wasting tens of millions of dollars on lawyers fighting people with disabilities in the courts. This government's wasting tens of millions of dollars on consultants. The other thing is this government can't manage price rip-offs and overcharging by elements within the service provision of the NDIS. The way to run the scheme is to make sure that people aren't getting ripped off. It's not to stop a person getting a wheelchair, a blind guy getting a white cane, or children with autism getting speech pathology and occupational therapy.
Well, sure, but I mean, the scheme is huge. It was a new idea. It's been built from the ground up. There are always going to be teething problems, aren't there? And part of those problems are about how to, the size of people's plans, what goes into a person's plan, who's eligible, all of that. Are you saying that the problems are more than that?
I think the scheme is becoming a bureaucratic nightmare for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people. On the upside, the NDIS is changing people's lives for the better. No one wants to go back to what it was beforehand. But at the moment, doing your NDIS plan is becoming practically a second full-time job. The agency's not transparent. We don't see the data upon which it makes all these catastrophic warnings about cost blowouts. There's no co-design with people in the scheme. I'm convinced money's being wasted. There are false economies right across the scheme. And at the end of the day, you could sum up Labor's policy on the NDIS in 2 words: restore trust. Because there's no trust at the moment between people on the scheme. And if you've currently got a good plan, you are up at midnight worrying that the next review it'll be cut. That's not the way the scheme was designed.
What's going on with those reviews? There's been a 400% increase in challenges to those reviews to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. More and more people, as you say, are sort of anxious about it because more and more people are getting their NDIS plans and allowances cut. Who's doing the reviews and what's the problem? Are they being cut unfairly? Is that what you're saying, that you would put fairness back into that? Or are they fair and valid?
No, they're not fair and valid. What's happening is that thousands of people get their plans cut at review time, so that's from one year to the next. A lot of people think this is unfair.
I mean, obviously there's got to be processes within public money. Why are they being cut? What's happening? Is it a mindset? What are you saying?
I'm saying there's not enough experienced people in the agency. I'm saying on the record that I think the instruction's gone out, stop the number of kids with autism getting on the scheme. They don't want people with psychosocial conditions in such numbers coming on the scheme. And the housing situation's a bureaucratic quagmire. These are the real pressures on the scheme. But what does the government do? The government's just saying, rather than managing prices and overcharging, rather than making sure that people are not caught up in a bureaucratic maze, they've just sent out the instruction, cut people off the scheme, reduce their plans. Like, here's a perfect example of the stupidity of the current leadership of the government in this area. If you get a plan for $50,000 or $60,000, if you don't spend it all, say you only spend $40,000 because you couldn't get the services or what have you, your plan gets cut by the unexpended portion that you haven't spent in the previous year. So what that tells people is there's no reward for being frugal. There's no reward for the difficulties that you experience in getting services. You'd be better off saying to people, if you don't expend all of your plan in one 12-month period, you don't automatically lose it in the next 12-month period, because you are sending a perverse signal in the system that if you don't spend it all, you lose it. And of course, you might spend it in the last couple of months on things which aren't the wisest things to spend it on, but because the government's telling you that if you don't spend it, you lose it. Well, this is just it's a silly way to run a system, isn't it?
So you'd change that. That's one thing you definitely would change.
Yeah, listen, what we'd like to do in our first 100 days, and you can't turn around a big ship like the NDIS in 100 days, but if we get elected and I get to be the NDIS minister, I want to blitz the waiting lists of all the matters at the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. There's too many matters there where the cost of running the claim is greater than the amount being argued about, and that's not to take into account the trauma. Another thing I'd like to do is bring in the universities, the TAFEs, the registered training organisations, the employers and the unions, and people with disability. So what are we going to do to create a pipeline of new workers for this sector?
Okay.
Another thing I want answers for in the first... Anyway, we've got a 100-day plan as well.
All right, just to clarify one thing that happened today, Anthony Albanese said Labor's putting additional funding into health, education and the NDIS. You've said Labor's plan will operate within the existing NDIS budget. Who's right, you or your leader?
Anthony's referring to our commitment to put extra staff into the NDIA.
But it's not extra
we're
funding.
Going to put an extra 380 staff. Well, extra funding into the National Disability Insurance Agency, who administer the NDIS. We're also going to put extra money into advocacy funding, which means that people who have got to deal with harsh decisions can get access to advocacy rather than dealing with top end of town lawyers on their own. So there'll be extra resources for the administration of the NDIS. The NDIS in itself is a demand-driven program.
Bill Shorten, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Well, 4 weeks living and working in close proximity to the Prime Minister and the man who wants to be demands a certain degree of stamina for everyone on the election campaign trail, so-called, whether they be staff or with the media. We got a sense of some of the frustrations that come with that this week, especially for the weary media pack after endless travel on buses, planes and with their ranks thinning from COVID infections. When the flow of daily policy announcements slowed down, the tone and volume of questions in the all-important daily media conferences definitely went up. That's generated discussion about what's a legitimate line of inquiry to hurl at both of these senior politicians, what they should know and what they shouldn't be expected to. So for some perspective on campaign dynamics, tactics and why those media conferences can be important, why the temperature's even going up a little, we've brought together two people who've been involved in this for many years. Joining us today, Chief Political Correspondent at The Conversation, Michelle Grattan. Welcome, Michelle, and National Affairs Editor at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, James Massola, both here in the studio. Of course, welcome and welcome back to Afternoon Briefing. Michelle, you've written in The Conversation that pursuing gotchas is as easy as shooting fish in a barrel, and it does seem that the public is bothered by this. Are you?
Well, I think sometimes gotchas are fair enough. I think that it is reasonable, for example, if petrol prices are sky high, that a leader should know more or less what the petrol price is. But I think in terms of asking people, and that's been the debate this week, asking a leader for what are your 6 points is, I guess, a memory test. And I think that the public think, well, surely really the media should be penetrating more into what do each of these points mean, what are the costings, what are the upsides, the downsides, the problems, rather than just saying, give us a list.
And that's the sort of line of inquiry that you'd rather see, professionally speaking, pursued?
I think that's what the public would rather see pursued. I think that they believe that the media play games and the politicians play games, and frankly I think many people are disillusioned and put off by both those groups playing.
I think there's not too much more empathy or support for the media than there is for politicians, James. But, well, first of all, I suppose, do you regard those sorts of questions as gotchas? I mean, is your view any different to Michelle's? Is it legitimate inquiry?
Look, broadly speaking, I think I agree with Michelle. Yes, of course, it's a gotcha, but I think the questions operate at two levels. At one level, you know, it is a memory test, and that's a sort of a surface level inquiry, if you want. But as the would-be Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese shouldn't be walking around holding press conferences saying, we've got a 6-point plan, oh, but I don't know what the 6 points are. I think that's a bad look. So in one sense, I think the media's questions are legitimate. But to pick up Michelle's point, I think probably of more interest to voters are how will they actually implement greater efficiencies in the administration of the NDIS? How will they pay for these additional staff? What does it mean if you put people with a disability on the NDIA board? You know, some of the 6 points that Albanese and Shorten have been talking about, or not talking about as they should have been. But the detail actually matters, and people want to know that too.
And Michelle, I think you've observed elsewhere that it's not always a fair battle, if you like, in this contest of wills. In fact, having been around a while, I think you've noted that many of the journalists are reading questions, whereas Anthony Albanese is handed a folder.
Well, that's right. I think if you're going to say, well, give us all the points, well, perhaps you shouldn't have to have a prompt in your hand, but...
is that a modern tactic or technique, just because we can these days with our mobile phones?
I think it is a modern tactic, although obviously at, say, the National Press Club, people take a piece of paper to the lectern or whatever to ask their questions. Perhaps it's a security blanket more than anything else. But on the campaign trail, you do see these days head officers, of course, asking the journalists to ask a question, which may be to fit a story that's being produced, or it may be in a regional area where you don't have a journalist from Canberra who's across all the issues. You've got a local person and they ask that question. Yeah. But one additional point on this whole gotcha thing, I think it also depends on how the leader handles that situation. And if they can't answer the question, then they need to be able to give perhaps a general statement, then say, now I'm going to get the policy and I'm going to take you through these 6 points in detail.
Right. So yes, whether you call it hand-to-hand combat or more like conducting an orchestra then, how does Anthony Albanese rate as one able to control that environment in front?
I don't think he's controlled it very well during this campaign. I don't think he's a naturally great campaigner, frankly, and he is now, of course, dragged down by clearly not feeling well after COVID. Right. He's not back to full form. You do see him grabbing a glass of water quite often, and if you're on the campaign trail, you're just getting over COVID, you're under a lot of pressure that's not just the normal campaign pressure.
Sure, I imagine there is a bit of stoicism in punching through a 6-week campaign or the back end of a 6-week campaign when you're recovering from an illness like that. Now, we are talking a lot about Anthony Albanese, not to let Scott Morrison off the hook, but it was Anthony Albanese, James, who seemed to get most of it. After 25, almost 26 years in the Parliament, are you surprised, or one, do you agree with Michelle, he's not the strongest campaigner you'll ever see, and does that surprise you?
Look, it does a little bit, but a couple of observations, Greg. Jim Chalmers, Jason Clare and Bill Shorten, when he was opposition leader, clearly had a bit more skill in saying, right, I've taken your question, now to you, I don't accept the premise of that, I'll let my shadow answer this. They just ran the press pack a little bit better than Anthony has done. He has sharpened up during the course of the campaign. I think that's clear. But he hasn't had that sort of level of match fitness or experience. Again, Tony Abbott was another master at doing this. And to look at the PM for a moment, Scott Morrison does it very well. He doesn't accept the premise of the question, that if he doesn't like it, he really rattles off a long answer quite regularly and then pivots away to something else. And one other point that a Labor person mentioned to me a couple of days ago, in the Parliament, in question time, Morrison has this habit or this custom where he starts an answer and then he says, and I'll get my my minister to add to the answer. Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, the former most recent PMs, none of them ever did that. Right. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that, but it's a technique that Morrison uses and uses effectively, and he does it so well, no one's kind of twigged to it, if you like. Right,
but he's not doing that on the campaign. Anthony Albanese is.
No, true, but in both situations, both men are facing pressure, they're facing questions. If Morrison doesn't know the answer, he defers, but he doesn't do it in a way that has caused trouble for him in the way that Albanese has done during the course of the campaign. It's actually pretty normal to do that. Yeah. Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey, I went back, they did at least 12 press conferences together in 2013. And I remember, and you guys would probably too, Abbott would regularly defer to Hockey on economic matters, and no one thought anything of it. Yeah, right. It's funny, we're talking about it at length right now, and it's not completely new. One final one, Michelle, the boredom factor. How much do you think journalists are, amping up the volume a little because there's a paucity of actual announcements coming through in this latter stage anyway?
Well, I think that's one element possibly. They also might have been rather tired if they've been out.
There's a bit of that,
on the trail, although people, of course, rotate. But nevertheless, it's hard yakka for the journalists as well. But also, I think now the journalists do see themselves as players in the sense of wanting their questions to be seen on television, especially if they come from television outlets. And so this is another thing too. You sometimes get longer questions than you might have had in a previous time, or than you might have in a press conference where it's not going to get so much national attention. Yeah, that's the sort of long-range perspective you would expect from Michelle Grattan, who's seen so many of these, and I think you'd probably agree, James, the dynamics of the television coverage. There's a bit of stage management on these events. Well, look, time has beaten us, so we're going to thank both of you, James Massola and Michelle Grattan, for some pretty interesting observations on this phenomenon of the week on Afternoon Briefing.
Well, let's talk now. We mentioned earlier that former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull entered this political debate today saying the increasing support for independence is a reflection of disenchanted Liberal voters who care about social issues and climate change, taking matters into their own hands. The Teal independents are hoping to succeed where the Greens have struggled, converting a national vote in the double digits into seats in the lower house. Casey Briggs takes a look at the performance of minor parties and independents in Australia and how their campaign strategies have changed.
Across the country, a collection of independents are trying to influence the political process, energising their communities to recreate scenes like this on May 21. Zali Steggall managed to unseat a former Prime Minister 3 years ago.
Tonight, Warringah has definitely voted for the future.
The so-called Teal candidates are mostly women contesting safe Liberal seats.
Hi, I'm Sophie Scoms.
Because it's our future and not theirs.
I'm Dr Monique Ryan and I'm your independent candidate for Kooyong.
I think Boothby is wide open.
They're running professional campaigns with lots of volunteers, financially backed by an organisation founded by one of Australia's richest men. And many of them are giving inner city Liberal sitting members a scare.
Now, the fake independents are fake because they're organised and acting as a political party.
In no way are we a party. As I've said before, we don't start campaigns, we don't select candidates.
The independents are hoping to make the most of growing disillusionment with the major parties and succeed where other minor parties have struggled in the House of Representatives.
People are not necessarily now wanting to see other parties fill the space as much as they are realising that local independents will be more responsive to their electorates.
So, are we at the tipping point? This isn't the first time minor parties and independents have had high hopes. Is this the year the ranks of the crossbench swell and independents crash the party? Let's start with the inroads that candidates who aren't from Labor or the Coalition have been making. Votes have been slipping away from the two major parties and into the hands of minor parties and independents. But it's not happened overnight. The third party vote for the lower house has doubled from 12% to more than 25% since 2007. And because of the way our election system works, that 25% of the vote in 2019 translated to just 6 seats in the House, or about 4% of elected members.
It's a decline in the major party vote that's only going one way, and that's down.
And the national polls suggest there's a very good chance that non-major party vote climbs again this year. But of course, that vote is split between candidates with all sorts of political views.
Insane cult of vaccinists that have taken control of our health bureaucracies.
And making the big coal corporations start to pay for some of the damage that their product has caused.
And it's not the national vote that matters in individual seats, it's how much of the vote gets concentrated on a single candidate. In the 90s, the first minor party rock stars were the Democrats. Their primary vote peaked in 1996, but then crumbled away in the 2000s.
I believe they wanted a change.
Then came One Nation, getting 9% of the vote in the first election it contested in 98.
So close that many of them can almost smell the victory.
Before also disintegrating.
Well, I don't think it's a matter of who takes the blame.
Although, since Pauline Hanson's return to the party's leadership, its vote has risen again from near zero to about 3%.
That's unfinished business for me.
The biggest minor party since 2004 has been the Greens, but they've been unable to exceed their 2010 vote in the 3 elections since then. And in the same period, votes parked with other small parties and independent candidates, they've grown from 7% to nearly 12%. That includes about 3.5% for the United Australia Party last election. Of all the challengers, the most likely prospects to win a new seat off the major parties this time are the inner city independents and the Greens, both of whom have some very similar key issues.
How much are Climate 200 candidates eating into donations that would otherwise help your campaign?
Look, I welcome the entrance of the climate independents into the democratic race. The more voices that are pointing out Liberal and Labor's poor record on climate, the better. But we're actually not really in competition with the climate independents in any seats.
The Greens are avoiding competition by not going into electorates where they're going to encounter too many independents.
Demographics could also be a factor. The independents and Greens seem to be going after different groups. Seats being targeted by independents tend to be older than the Greens' strongholds, with a median age about 5 years higher. Household incomes in those inner city independent targets are also higher. For the independents to have much chance of beating their Liberal incumbents, they'll need to peel some of the vote away from them, getting the MPs down to about 45% or lower, and get their own primary vote to at least 30%. From there, they'd hope to pick up the bulk of preferences from other candidates to win. The more of them that do win seats, the more likely it is we end up with a hung parliament.
We have the Simon Holmes Court Climate 200 candidates refusing to be upfront with their own constituents, the people they want to vote for them, and not telling them who they would back in the event of a hung parliament, which is their stated goal.
The independents will form their own opinion on which party is able to deliver on the issues that they have a mandate for. So this is absolutely a decision for each of them individually.
Just like 2010. Evening all. And then we could be hanging on their every word, waiting for them to determine the next PM.
So we're going to have a good, hearty meeting and more than likely continue tomorrow morning.
Well, that was a marathon last time around. We wonder what will happen this election night. Casey Briggs with that report. Well, a record number of young people have enrolled to vote in this election. The Prime Minister was asked again today why young people should vote for the Coalition.
For young people today, because of the strong economic management we've provided, they can look forward to their future with confidence because we're getting the youth unemployment rate down.
So is there such a thing actually as the youth vote? And if so, what are the issues that matter to first-time voters? I'm joined now by Tom Crowley from the Daily Oz and Guardian Australia's Matilda Boseley. Welcome both of you to Afternoon Briefing.
Thank you.
Tom, more young voters, more first-time voters enrolled this time than ever before. How's that impacting this election campaign as you see it? Is it a factor?
I think it is. I mean, as you say, I think you can't, sort of stereotype too much any group of voters, including young voters, and there's obviously going to be a diverse range of views. But we've got a fairly young audience that we've spent quite a bit of time sort of talking to about the issues that matter to them, and they're exactly the ones that you'd expect. A lot of sort of future-focused issues like climate change, housing affordability. And I think the common thing that we hear from our audience is kind of, they're not used to engaging in mainstream politics, maybe a bit turned off by mainstream politics, but coming to this election with a great sense of frustration at the lack of meaningful conversation and meaningful progress on those sorts of issues. So I think in terms of sort of forcing some of those questions to the front, as we heard the PM have to answer today, I think that's maybe where the youth sort of influence comes in, is just trying to shift that conversation towards some of those big future issues.
Last time I looked, your Daily Oz had, I think, 350,000 followers, something like that. Are they? Can you see their engagement much on this?
We can, yeah. So it's mostly, I mean, it's not sort of exclusively, but mostly a young audience, and they're really, really very engaged. And what we find is, I think our audience probably less interested in, I suppose, what you'd call the political intrigue and the ins and outs and the way that most of us often talk about politics, really, really, really care about the detail and really, really have a big appetite for thinking about, what are the policies on offer? What are we going to do to tackle these big structural challenges? We get huge engagement with this kind of thing. And I suppose a group of people who are maybe not engaging with traditional media, traditional politics, but really, really, really actively engaged at this time of year in a way that's quite uplifting to see, and also interesting to see what an effect it'll have in the election.
Matilda, TikTok's more your space. Is there much engagement there from young voters about this election? And, is it uplifting kind of interest and engagement?
I'm not sure I'd categorise it as uplifting. Look, I think there's definitely conversations there, but what I'm seeing is a lot of kind of frustration and anger, really, about kind of the lack of discussion about some of those issues that are really important to young people, which is interesting because you see a lot of politicians kind of on the platform, trying to relate to young people there, but then perhaps not following through with the actual sort of issues that these people are actually wanting to see. So
let's talk about that. Let's talk about it. Talk about how the major parties, how they're going generally, in general terms, at engaging on a platform like TikTok.
Yeah, a mixed bag, I'd say. There's, of course, this sort of Scott Morrison joined TikTok around Christmas and then ever since has had comments turned off on every single video, which I think is a fairly good indication of how things are going for him on the platform. There's heaps of politicians. Julian Hill has a big following on there. But I'd say as a general trend, Greens and Labor tend to be more successful on the platform than Liberals or Nationals or the United Australia Party or parties on that sort of side of things. But also, it's not a totally warm reception everywhere they go, but I think the more kind of authentically politicians treat the viewers on that platform, or the more they genuinely are giving the time of day, I think the better it comes across, rather than just sort of the more pandering kind of doing a TikTok trend. Let
me ask you about issues, because Tom mentioned, the obvious future ones, climate and housing affordability. What other issues are you seeing come up on TikTok?
Yeah, so housing affordability is huge, climate change is huge, mental health, as well as kind of university structures. People are worried about HECS debts. But yeah, really, I mean, look, climate and housing have to be sort of the two biggest, as well as, during the last few months, there's been a lot of discussions about the legal protections that we afford to LGBT, transgender students. Mm-hmm. And that was something that was very, very much like every young person I've spoken to was keenly aware of that and weren't particularly delighted by either side. But I think, that's definitely made an impression on that age group.
Tom, you heard the Prime Minister a little earlier. He was asked today and he said young people can look forward to the future because of the government's economic policies, chiefly getting the youth unemployment rate down. Is there an appreciation, do you think, or is the young voters going to give the government many points for the way they've handled the economy through the pandemic to get us out to the other side without really huge unemployment queues?
Well, I mean, I think focusing just on the youth unemployment figure is missing a lot of important parts of the picture, and definitely I think every time we sort of post about unemployment and these sorts of issues, our audience is sort of quick to point out and has a keen understanding of sort of slow wages growth being another one, and then with inflation at the moment, I suppose the rising cost of living. There's also consciousness about insecure work, something that the Labor Party's spending a lot of time talking about. So I think that kind of to just focus on sort of the youth unemployment and I suppose a single number as a reflection of how young people are faring and suggesting that maybe they should be pleased with that. I suspect that what young people are after is a sort of a more serious and detailed conversation than that. Obviously, it was just a quick answer. But yeah, I think that there's a whole range of different economic measures that young people feel in their everyday lives at the moment. Cost of living, I think, is a big one. And
you both mentioned housing. Let's talk about what they're getting in this, because former Reserve Bank Governor Ian Macfarlane, a man not really known for colourful language, said this week that young Australians should be squealing louder about the growing wealth inequality gap. Now, obviously, much of that is about housing. You both talked about that. If you own one, you're wealthy. If you don't, it's getting harder to get it on that wealth train. Has there been much response or assessment or even awareness of the housing policies on offer from the major parties? Anthony Albanese had something to offer in the...
Yeah, look, I think there's a certain amount of nihilism within this age group when it comes to housing, where there's the sentiment like, I'll just never be able to afford a house is probably said, every third political video. That being said, I don't think the expansion of the Liberal first home buyers sort of guarantor
the deposit scheme.
Yes, sorry, that's of course the word, the deposit scheme, has really made a bit of an impact. I think the feeling is that it's just still a very, very small number compared to the amount of people who are wanting to get into the housing market. Albanese's proposal, the shared equity scheme, I think made a little bit more of an impact, but I don't really think anyone's fully just counting on being able to afford a house anyway. That being said, I think maybe there's been a little rays of hope from the Albanese side, but yeah, it's really the conversation is like, this is terrible, and less what are the actual solutions, I think.
Okay, I must say I've heard a lot of people younger than me, and that's a lot of people, cursing the baby boomers. Is there a level of sort of anger amongst young voters about what their economic futures look like? We've talked about the home ownership and that mountain to climb, the cost of education, secure work, the $1 trillion debt that will ultimately fall on their shoulders. And do you think there is a sense amongst many young voters of a pox on both their houses? And if so, can you see their vote going more to independents or minor parties, or what do you think? Tom? Just briefly, both.
Yeah, I think that there is that sort of frustration, and I guess that's where it comes down to the kind of the electoral maths of it, and the baby boomer cohort being a much larger group. And we've seen what it influences every time sort of housing policies come up. Anything that might reduce housing prices, is kind of vociferously opposed. And so I think that that's part of where that frustration comes from. So those record numbers of enrolment, I suppose it's pushing in the right direction. And over time, that might start to change, and those tides might change. But for now, I think you're right, Fran, a lot of frustration.
Matilda, what do you think? Can you see where the votes are going?
Look, I mean, it's always hard to tell, right? Like, you're never quite sure if you've got, like, the real sort of in touch with the whole community, or you're just sort of in yet another kind of bubble when it comes to sort of online. But look, I think that there is a lot of frustration with the current administration, especially in the young group. And I think there's a lot of excitement around some of the teal independents in Goldstein, in Frydenberg's electorate, and the idea of breaking some of those moulds. I don't think that's just because young people are sort of, would never vote for the Liberals or anything. I genuinely think it's because of of the policies that are being offered. And we know young people are really policy-based voters, and kind of neither major party are giving them much to work with.
All right. Well, thank you, both of you, for joining us today.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
Matilda Boseley and Tom Crowley.
Yeah, well, Fran, I suppose if we had to draw a bit of a trend line through some of the discussions we've had on afternoon briefing today, it would be around the issue of independence and the potential for a hung parliament. You get the impression, Fran, if you talk to people in the background of politics, but also watch those up on the stage, specifically Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese, that they're settling on the view that this is very much in play now.
Now, I was struck, Greg, by the Scott Morrison presser today, how hard he went and how long he went on about it, the danger, in his words, of, you know, the chaos of a hung parliament. Then there, again with you, Littleproud, David Littleproud, talking about, you know, how unworkable, how unsafe it would be in terms of national security if they had to negotiate with all these people. I mean, it really doesn't stand up to logic, don't we, when they talk about, imagine if we'd had to handle a pandemic, because most of the pandemic handling was done between the Prime Minister and the state and territory leaders, by and large.
And what wasn't, Fran, was done on a pretty sensible, multi-partisan basis anyway, wasn't it?
Exactly right. So it's a scare campaign there, certainly from the Prime Minister. Labor's into it too, and neither of them want to serve, would like to hold power in a hung parliament, that is for sure. But I think, you know, if we think back to the Gillard government, Gillard Parliament, hung parliament with Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott, that wasn't chaotic, and you know, David Littleproud talking about...
It had its moments, but anyway, yeah, generally
Well, it had its moments, but that was more about numbers, less about the intervention of those politicians in particular. I think it was more about how the numbers were managed in a House. That's a different thing altogether.
Yeah, no, that's true. I guess the thing is, you know, our whole entire system, just like that in the UK, the US and Canada, is really designed, at least in lower house voting systems, around a strong two-party system. What we're seeing with each passing election, Fran, is a big question over just how strong those two parties themselves are. I think it's a matter of public record now, Fran, that national membership of the Liberal Party is about 50,000 people. Yeah. It doesn't scream, you know, really strong grassroots movements here, and maybe that underlines all of this that's going on at the moment.
Yeah, just briefly, I think that underpoints the speech from Malcolm Turnbull in Washington, where he's talking about, you know, Liberal voters who've always voted Liberal, but they want those values, those social values and climate issues, you know, protected and represented and argued in the Parliament, and they feel like they're not getting that from their party at the moment. So if there's a strong vote in that direction, it might start moving the Liberal Party, for instance, further in that direction.
Yeah, there are lots of vulnerabilities there. All of this, Fran, becomes very real come Monday, for 17 million Australians anyway, because you can start pre-poll voting from there. So we'll be back then, won't we, Fran? I think that's just about it for us today, though.
See you Monday.
Comedian Griff Rhys-Jones is taking in an immense, huge and almighty land.
This truly is Canada. Magnificent.
The only way.
Oh! Did you hear that?
He knows how.
Welcome aboard, sir.
Thank you.
What we're using is what nature provides.